Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are diving into something incredibly dense, but it's also foundational to pretty much everything that runs on your computer. We're looking at the ultimate instruction manual, the metadata inside an x86-64 ELF relocatable object file.
That title definitely screams pure compiler jargon ahead. But the mission of this deep dive is really to demystify it. I mean, understanding this file, it's like getting the architectural blueprint for how software components are actually constructed and stitched together. This metadata is the definitive manual the system uses to assemble your program.
And to make this a bit more, understandable, we're framing this whole discussion with the flat pack furniture kit analogy. The file we're analyzing isn't the finished bookshelf, not at all. It's the unopened box, full of components, instructions, bolts, labels, all waiting for assembly by, let's say, a very efficient but very pedantic construction crew we call the linker.
Exactly. And the first step of any assembly is checking the label on the box, right? Make sure you have the right kit for the right system. That's the ELF header. It establishes the file's core identity.
So what does that identity tell us right away?
Well, first, it says it's an ELF-64 class file. So it's built for a modern 64-bit architecture. It also specifies the data is stored in little Endian format, and that's a critical detail.
Okay, for those of us who don't spend our days looking at bytes, little Endian, what does that practically mean here?
It just means that when you have multi-byte data, like a number that takes up 64 bits, the least significant byte comes first in memory. It's the order expected by the majority of chips you use every day, especially from Intel and AMD. It's a design choice that immediately anchors this file to that specific hardware.
So it's basically confirming the file is designed for the architecture we all know as Advanced Micro Devices x86-64. It knows its audience.
And finally, the type is REL, meaning it's a relocatable file. It's a component, a single piece of that furniture kit. It's waiting to be combined with other pieces. It absolutely cannot run on its own yet. It's a key ingredient, not the final meal.
Right. Okay, so we've confirmed the label on the box. Now let's look inside at the sheer scale of the organization here. I was genuinely surprised by how meticulously this is all organized. Even for what I assume is a tiny program, it's divided into 29 distinct sections.
That organization is completely non-negotiable in modern compilation. If the ELF header is the label on the box, then the section header table is the complete table of contents. It's the blueprint's index. It tells the operating system and the linker precisely where every single component is, how large it is, and what its job is.
And this vital table isn't even at the beginning of the file. It starts pretty far in at an offset of 20,928 bytes.
Correct. And that's a significant amount of space dedicated just to metadata before you even get to the code. Each of those 29 sections needs a 64-byte header describing it. So you have all these headers meticulously laid out, guiding the linker on how to navigate the file and correctly pull everything out, the code, the data, all of it.
All right, let's open the box then and find the actual physical parts, the wood and the hardware. In programming terms, that means the core executable code. And that lives mostly in one place, the .text section.
The .text section is where the compiled executable instructions, the raw machine code, reside. If you wrote a function in C++sin, this is where the CPU instructions for that function are stored. The flags in the section header even confirm its purpose, AX, which stands for alloc and execute.
Alloc and execute. So load it into memory, and the CPU has permission to run it. Simple enough. And we also see a specific section just for getting things started, right?
Yep, that's .text.startup. It contains instructions strictly for the initialization phase. Think of it as the code that runs before your main function ever gets called. It's setting up the environment, making sure everything starts in a stable state.
Okay, so moving from instructions to storage, we've got variables. This brings us to .data for things with initial values, and then the slightly more mysterious .bs section.
The .data section is the easy one to get your head around. It holds all your initialized global and static variables, things you explicitly gave a value to in your source code. Its flags are WA, write, and alloc, confirming it needs memory and can be changed while the program is running.
But the real optimization lesson here comes from .bs. This is where the file size savings really kick in.
Absolutely. The .bs section is reserved for uninitialized data. What's fascinating here, and this is a key insight, is that the section header marks it as NOBITS.
NOBITS? Why not just put a bunch of zeros in the file? Why does the linker need a placeholder for data that doesn't exist yet?
Because that would be a massive waste of disk space. Imagine you declared a 1 gigabyte uninitialized array. The file itself would be a gigabyte larger, just filled with zeros. By using NOBATS, the file occupies zero space on the disk for that array. It's like the instruction manual says, we need 50 empty buckets here. But the box is empty because it assumes the operating system will supply and zero out those buckets when the program starts.
Wow. So the linker is basically optimizing the whole delivery by trusting the OS to handle the setup later. That's efficiency engineered right down to the byte level.
And finally, you have the constants, the parts that shouldn't move or change. That's ROData.str1.1.
And based on the name, this seems to be for read-only data, specifically string constants, like text you print to the console. The flags reflect that too. AMS-ALEC, merge, strings. So they're fixed, but the linker can consolidate similar strings during the final assembly. Okay, we found the code and the data, the parts. But these pieces don't know where their neighbors are yet. That's where the actual assembly manual comes in, the relocation sections.
This is probably the most important set of instructions for the linker. Relocation sections, they usually start with .rela, and they contain precise byte-by-byte instructions. They tell the linker how and where to patch or modify addresses. They fix every pointer, every function call, when this object file gets combined with others into the final program.
So if my code calls a function, let's say test, this section holds a little note saying, hey, linker, don't forget to write the actual address of test right here later on.
Precisely. Let's look at a concrete example. The .rela.text table. This specific table at offset 0 by 2008 contains 7 distinct entries. These entries are resolving references made inside that main executable code block we just talked about.
And these are resolving things like external library symbols, like ZST forkout, the standard C++ output stream. So we see references to the outside world and also references back to internal parts, like the strings in .ROData.str1 type 1.
Yes, but the relocation type is the real key here. Notice the use of the very specific x86-64 PLT32 type for those complex C++ symbols.
Okay, now we've hit the deep jargon wall. What does x86-64 PLT32 actually tell the linker to do?
It's a very specific, practical instruction for dynamic linking. It tells the linker, don't try to find the final address of this external function right now. Instead, set up a special jump instruction, a trampoline, via something called the procedure linkage table, or PLT. This is what allows dynamic libraries to be loaded and resolved at runtime. It's how your program can still call functions from the C++IO library.
That really makes dynamic linking so much more tangible. It's not magic. It's a specific, coded instruction telling the construction crew how to build a connection bridge.
And speaking of specific details, the source notes that the .rela.text.startup section, which handles those initialization instructions, contains only one entry. That single instruction is probably the very first thing the linker has to connect to make sure the program starts correctly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to reverse engineer or, piece together the original source code, the directory system. This is the Rosetta Stone, the index that gives names to all those raw addresses. Let's look at the symbol table, .simtab.
The .simtab is the file's central directory. Its inventory list. It enumerates everything the file either defines or references from the outside. In our file here, the symbol table contains 18 entries.
And that list gives us crucial insight into the original program's language and structure. For instance, we see the function main, which is easy, but also these cryptic namespaced symbols like Z4testy.
Those odd characters, the Z4testy or ZST forkout, that's C++ name mangling in action. It's the compiler's way of encoding a function's parameters and its namespace right into its name. It ensures every function has a unique identifier across the whole project.
So the presence of those specific mangled names is a massive clue, a confirmation, really, that this component was compiled from C++ source code. The file is telling us its origin story.
Exactly, and the .simtab itself only contains pointers and metadata about these 18 symbols. The actual human-readable names are stored separately in the string tables. We actually have 3 different ones here.
3? How do we keep them straight?
Well, first, there's .strab, the main string table. This holds the actual string names for the symbols we just looked at, the main, Z4testy, and so on. Second is .strab, the section header string table. That one holds the names of the organizational bins themselves, .text, .data, .sas.
So one table names the variables and functions, and another table names the structural containers that hold them. And finally, there's .debugstr, which is a dedicated table used just for labels and source file names specific to the debugging process.
Yeah, it's funny. If the core components, the code and data, are relatively small, the amount of metadata needed to correctly link and debug them is just enormous.
It really is.
And that becomes so obvious when you look at the section list. Sections 8 through 20, a huge chunk of this file, are dedicated entirely to debugging metadata. That's almost half the sections just for human readability. This is the hidden debugging layer. Its purpose is purely practical, but it's incredibly important. It allows tools like debuggers to map the compiled machine code all the way back to the original source code that you wrote. It's what makes the system intelligible to a person.
And we can see the specific roles in that layer, too. We have .debuginfo, which seems to be the core dwarf metadata, detailing variables, types, scope. That's the structural data.
And critically, there's .debugline. This section maps the raw machine instructions not just back to the source file, but to the specific source code line numbers that generated them. This is the difference between just seeing an error message and being able to step through your code line by line to fix it. Without this bulk of metadata, complex software development would just stall completely.
Okay, moving past the debug info, there are a few other essential system components that ensure stability and identify the execution environment.
Right, we find sections that define the operating characteristics. For instance, .airframe contains crucial information for exception handling and stack unwinding. If your program crashes, this metadata allows the OS to correctly interpret the call stack and show you where things went wrong. It's vital for system stability.
And what about that specialized notes section, the .note.gnu.property?
That section contains runtime properties. It specifically details the precise x86 ISA used, which in this case is x86-64 baseline. It's the file declaring the specific processor features it expects to find, which helps ensure compatibility.
And we can't forget the simple.comment section. It probably just stores metadata about the compiler version used, a tiny note on a massive blueprint.
So what does this all mean? We started with a single component file, defined its purpose with a simple header, and then walked through all 29 sections. We saw the executable core, the highly optimized data stores, the linker's explicit instructions for patching addresses, and then the exhaustive directories of symbols and debugging maps.
I think the major takeaway is that these specialized metadata sections, the .simtab, the .stratab, and especially those .relatables, they are the ultimate connective tissue. They exist solely to enable compilation and dynamic linking across unbelievably complex systems. They ensure that a simple function like main can call a C++ stream like zst4count correctly, no matter where that external library eventually lives in memory.
It's the complexity that's required to make simplicity possible.
And that leads to a provocative final thought, building on how incredibly detailed just this one tiny object file is. We saw that this single relocatable object requires dozens of debug sections and 7 specific relocation entries just for basic functions like outputting text and calling a single internal function. If that's the overhead for one small component, you have to imagine the instantaneous complexity, the sheer file size, and the millions of relocation instructions required for something massive like a modern operating system kernel just to get it linked, running, and securely maintained.
The linker really is the unsung hero of modern computing.
It really is. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the blueprint of the binary world.